Hello, and a warm welcome to Stockholm Free World Forum. My name is Oscar Johnson. I am director of the forum. I would in particularly welcome the delegation we have from the School of Advanced Military Studies from the US. And also because of that, I'm going to ask everybody after we're done here, by 1:15, we need to be out of this room because we're going to use it for another discussion right after. But I'm very happy to welcome you to the Stockholm launch of this paper, Russia's Military Posture in the Arctic, Managing Hard Power in a Low-Tension Environment. The Arctic is a region that has been partly a big buzzword in our part of the world, but also particularly in Sweden, it's been kind of left out. And as we see, we're not neighboring the ocean to the Arctic. But we talked about it, but we haven't done that much about it. And it's an uncritical part for Sweden in a military strategic sense. So, to the launch today, I'm very happy to welcome the author, Mathieu Boulègue, who is a research fellow at Chatham House, which I would say is probably one of the best Russia research program in Europe. Definitely one of the best. We had one of his colleagues, Keir Giles, here earlier in February for his launch. Mathieu has previously worked as a partner in risk management and strategic consultancy, and will today outline the main finding of his report, which there are some copies here in the room for those of you who want to read. Thereafter, we'll have Niklas Granholm, who is one of Sweden's leading experts on Arctic, who is the deputy director at the Swedish Defence Research Agency. He's been seconded to the MFA, the MOD, and he's a fellow at RUSI in the UK and the Royal Academy of War Science. So first I'm going to give the floor to Matthew. Please tell us what you've learned, and then I'm going to give Niklas a chance to comment on it.
Good. Thank you very much, Oscar and Niklas, for inviting me here. I don't know if I've learned much, but I hope that you can learn something out of that. So you have copies circulating of the report, which has a very nice picture and title. I can't vouch for the content, but at least half the job is done. I have a paper. So this event is on the record, which means that I will not be citing the Chatham House rule, unfortunately, which also means that it's this moment when the French guy working in the UK tells you about the Arctic. So everything I'm going to say is obviously fake news, and don't believe it until the Kremlin denies it. And you have a map of, I hope you can all see it, which Sweden doesn't appear, but you're still an Arctic country, right? At least in my eyes, you're an Arctic country. So okay, so this whole project started, I'm conscious of time, and I will be welcoming the discussion, started as me as a kind of defense and security analyst on Russia and Eurasia, wanting to look at sort of an both under-researched and over-researched area of the world, which is the Arctic. So over-researched because there's a lot of talk about the long-term impact of climate change and environmental protection around the Arctic, and then under-researched in the sense that Russia and Russia's military posture and defense and security implications have been somewhat left alone in terms of the pure military hard stuff. So I'm coming from more like a tanks and heavy weapons background, so I wanted to apply tanks and heavy weapons to the Arctic. And it does work. You can make maps and reports out of it. Only because there's a certain number of things when it comes to Russian defense and security matters that need to be demystified in the West, specifically regarding Russia's recent behavior and resurgence as a great power, what Russia would argue making Russia great again. And I think the Arctic does apply because it's a unique environment for both cooperation with the other Arctic nations and beyond, and competition, which makes it a very unique environment. So I'm going to talk a bit about the main conclusions of the reports in terms of Russia's posture in general, the deployments in the Arctic, and why does it matter altogether for the West, and what should be or could be a policy response, both from Arctic nations, but also at NATO level, because most of the bordering countries, and if not all the bordering countries, minus Sweden and Finland, are technically NATO members, which when you're Russia, you would argue the only Arctic country that is not Russia is NATO, which has fueling a lot of implications in terms of the mentality for Russia and its military posture. So the first thing I want to underline the question that comes back is there a remilitarization or a militarization of the Arctic? which means, is Russia placing a lot of stuff there, and is it dangerous for us? The easy answer is yes, there is a militarization of the Arctic. In terms of capabilities, in terms of placing assets on the ground, in the air, and subsea, there is indeed a militarization or remilitarization, depending on if you're counting on former Soviet assets of the region. Does it mean that we should be deterred or threatened by it? Then it's a question of the intention behind the capabilities. But if you look solely at Russia's posture and what they're actually doing, I would argue that Russia feels in a relative position of strength in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. I'm not talking about the Arctic beyond what is technically Russia's external borders, at sea and on land. And therefore, considering this relative position of strength, they actually want to assert a more overt force posture and a more assertive force posture. And this means a lot of signaling concerning their intentions of placing said assets on the ground. When you look at their priorities in terms of military deployments, you basically have two things to look into. The first one is what is commonly called the bastion perimeter or bastion defense, which has to do with safeguarding or creating a sort of sea denial and perimeter control around the Kola Peninsula, which is right about here, which represents 2/3 of Russia's nuclear sea-based deterrent. So when you're the Russian military leadership, the sea-based second strike deterrence is everything, both for the survivability of your deterrence, but also in terms of military priority, there's always money for the nuclear posture, which means that protecting and safeguarding the Kola Peninsula is everything. So it's about, once again, creating a sort of perimeter control around Kola. The second thing is border control. Climate change is changing a lot of things in the Arctic. Russia sees a new border opening in the north, and it responds the way Russia knows best, by securitizing and militarizing a region in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. So it's basic sovereignty enforcement over this new border, which is opening, but it's sovereignty enforcement with teeth, because it's, once again, what Russia knows best. It has teeth because it needs to have teeth in Russia's thinking, but also because it's actually easier when you look at the way Russia functions to place military assets instead of going through a very complicated cycle of civil-military relation or even civil procurement or civilian procurement. You actually go through the military, everything comes off the shelf, it's already there, you just need to send troops, have them build something, have them repair an airfield or build one of these bases like the tricolor bases or the Arctic Shamrock you might have seen in the press, and you have everything in no time with relatively small numbers of money that goes under the table or diverted into corruption, actually less than in the civilian side, which actually makes sense because Russia needs to build these things fast, cheap, and cheap. So it's easier to do things off the shelf from the military, which means that you have a lot of dual-use infrastructure, and I'm really insisting on the dual-use approach. A lot of what Russia's placing in the region, as disparate as it can be, has a lot to do with search and rescue operations, radar coverage for passage along the Northern Sea route, which is a commercial route that Russia hopes to deploy and has been hoping to deploy for the past 10 years, and a lot of environmental protection as well, and basic access in an environment that is hostile to man and to assets in general. So it's more dual use than anything. And when you look at what Russia's doing in terms of placing these assets, it's actually highly disparate. The network is not complete. And I have serious doubts personally that Russia is actually able to operate a full coverage in terms of radar, sensors, and basic domain awareness along its own border. It's cold, it's remote, it's complicated to access, which means a lot of things in terms of basic operations. When you look at Russia's strategy in general, the Arctic, what happens in the Arctic has nothing to do in the Arctic in the first place, for two reasons. The first one is that, come what may, if Russia wants to operate a sort of more assertive position in the Arctic, they will want to fight, to push the fight away from the Arctic as much as possible. Nobody wants to fight in the Arctic, especially Russia, which means that if they need to be more assertive, they would go south. They would go towards the Norwegian Sea, towards the GI-UK gap, and basically towards the North Atlantic Sea Line of Communication, which has a lot to do with NATO's new posture around the North Atlantic with the creation 2 years ago of the Joint Force Command in Norfolk, which technically has to do with protecting the sea line of communication for Baltic reinforcements. So once again, it's not about the Arctic. It is a remilitarization in the Arctic, but not really about the Arctic itself. It's about pushing, once again, this fight away from the Arctic as much as possible. Just as much as it is, what happens in the Arctic is not really about the Arctic itself, because Russia sees the whole region as a military continuum across now three military districts from the European Arctic to the Pacific Arctic. So it is about the Arctic very much because of geography, but it has a lot more to do with this military continuum in terms of operation. Why does it matter? I'm happy to field questions around the force structure a bit later and the role of the Northern Fleet in this infrastructure and the more military techie side of things. So why does it matter for us in the West? Well, one of the main problems we have now with this sort of new reassertion of Russia's military posture in the region is that it is creating a new operational front to look into, especially for NATO, as the Joint Force Command Norfolk is very much about the North, not just the North Atlantic, but also what happens north. And also because if you place military assets in this region, and if you push for a more militarized presence, it means that what we see in other theaters of operation, especially on the Eastern Front, will increase the level of miscalculation and potentially tactical errors. If any accidents happen, we need to have clear red lines established, and we need to have clear standard operating procedure in this region. So there's a certain number of things that we could be looking into, us as NATO and partner nations, conscious that Sweden has been very active in terms of interoperability in Arctic conditions with NATO and has been one of the forefront of an Arctic policy and pushing on the agenda for a sort of contingency planning. I'm not talking about the NATO strategy in the Arctic because we are way, way, way beyond that, but at least having a sort of understanding that we need special standards of operation. We need contingency planning. If come what may, NATO is pushed out of the sea line of communication in the North Atlantic beyond the Gute Gap and has to go north, we need to operate. We need to a certain domain and situational awareness and basic operation. I think Trident Juncture was a case in point that last October that the Arctic is a complicated environment. When you have troops from the south, southern NATO nations coming to the north and basically learning that the north is cold, which, trust me, when you're a troop from Greece or Spain and you actually come and you have zero protective gear and you can't even shoot your rifle because your gloves are too big, well, this is the sort of things that we need to wake up to in a way in terms of basic operation in this environment. And the last thing I will finish with is in terms of existing endeavors to actually operate in the Arctic. We have a lot of cooperative formats in terms of pure hard security things, notably the NORDEFCO cooperation formats, the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is kind of used as a spearhead for North Atlantic and Arctic operations. There needs to be a debate, and I think Nicholas would agree. We spent 4 days in Oslo on the NATO workshop. We need to ask ourselves the hard questions of should NATO be there in the first place? And if yes, how much NATO do we want? Because I would argue that placing NATO in such an environment would militarize it. If you put NATO everywhere, it's a war machine after all. So you would end up militarizing it. And if we really want to keep this feeling of low tension in an exceptional environment, there's a certain number of things we cannot do. Not because we just don't want to antagonize Russia, but also because it is imperative to keep cooperation at the level of Arctic Council and existing endeavors in the Arctic without militarizing or overly militarizing them too much, which would be detrimental for, once again, low tension and the good spirit of cooperation. Now, actually, Russia's been playing along. It's kind of, the hypocrisy of international relations is that Russia actually respects the rules and the norms when it comes to cooperation in the Arctic. And they're actually pioneers in many of the good behavior in the Arctic. Makes you wonder why they want to invade Crimea and break international law in the first place. But hey, happy to answer questions about why Russia's behaving like that and the necessity of cooperation. So, in as much as we understand the cost of entry in such an environment, there's a number of things we need to clear the debate on what should we do and how much should we be present as NATO and allied nations as a NATO +2 format in the Arctic. So I will stop there and I'll be happy to answer the questions about the many, many things I haven't said being conscious of time. Thank you.